I assure you, Carrie is not turning her back on us. She's got another computer back there where she's also playing the role of Katie, who is the host, so getting everybody the permissions. Rachel, did you get set with the pinning abilities there? All set. Wonderful. Okay, well then, given that we have a lot of information to talk through today, I'm going to dive us right in. We are currently missing a few members, but hopefully they'll join shortly. As I always do, I'll go over our technical and administrative items first. You know, you hear me talking to people that aren't here. I'm not losing my mind. We are streamed live on YouTube, and people will be watching this on other platforms. So you'll hear me talking to people that you may not see on screen, particularly members of the public. Members of this subcommittee, we do ask you, if you're in a place where it is comfortable and safe to do so, that you are on screen with your camera. Members of the public, we do ask you, if you join the Zoom, to leave your camera off until we get to public comment. Today, we are scheduled for a 2-hour meeting, and we'll have opportunity for public comment towards the end of today's meeting. Members, just 2 other quick reminders. Number 1, we ask that when you speak, you introduce yourself by full name the first time you speak, and then just by first name anytime you do speak. And we ask that everyone refrain from using the chat function. It can become distracting, not only for those who may be using a screen reader or other technology, but frankly, that chat gets distracting from our conversation when we want to focus on listening to one another. Our agenda today is pretty straightforward. We're going to talk about a new issue that's been raised by Chanda and by Julie Reskin, who's on the executive committee. We'll touch base on where we are with the first set of recommendations, or excuse me, not recommendations, ideas that you all generated around what we need to change in Colorado to remove some of the barriers for running for and serving in elected office. You should have received an email that those ideas are now live on Engage Dora. We'll spend some time today talking about some of the outreach. And then we're going to shift from running for and serving in office to what it's like to be employed by a government or government agency. And I think we may find there's some crossover in terms of the accessibility of buildings, but we want to go back to where we were this spring, talking about that full spectrum from finding out about government jobs, applying for them, interviewing, getting hired, onboarding, and then fulfilling the duties of serving or of working for government as a Coloradan with a disability. Before I go forward into our first topics, does anybody have any questions about the plans for today's meeting? Yes.
I am Shirley.
Cheryl, did you have a question for me before we start? Okay. We'll look forward to inviting you into the conversation when we get to public comment, if you'd like to, which will be at about 11:40 this morning. And if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you to turn off your camera until we get to public comment, so we just have the members of the subcommittee. But thank you very much for being with us today.
Saying I am on this committee. Oh,
Rachel?
she's saying that, she is, on this, yeah, she is showing up here for the committee meeting.
Yes, and right now we have only the appointed members of the subcommittee talking.
I am a member. I was a stakeholder? No. This is Shannon helping out a little bit, saying we're a little bit confused because we're confused about if it's public or if it's yeah.
Okay, so Cheryl, we don't have you as an appointed member. The official members of the committee were appointed by the governor's office, and that's the group you see on camera. We welcome you here to listen in and to provide comment when we get to public comment. Okay. So with that, there is an item that you received from Carrie. We sent out a little bit of background information. I'm gonna have Shanda talk about this. It's a unique situation where a challenge has come up and is being addressed outside of our committee and outside of the task force. It relates to access to care. And I'll let Shanda get into more of the details. As Shanda and I talked through this, there were aspects of it that may not fall under our committee's purview. As we go into it, I'm just going to read once again what we are tasked with and why we believe that this is something that could fall under both this committee and potentially under the CADA rewrite committee. But the purpose of our committee is to study and make recommendations on issues to ensure people with disabilities have access to the services they need, are able to effectively participate in public discussion, are able to be employed by government agencies, and can run for and effectively serve in elected positions. We've been working a little bit backwards on generating ideas, but when I zero in on that idea about being able to have access to the services they need, some of what Shanda and Julie raised concerns sufficient to me that I thought it made sense for us to have a conversation. And we're going to have to be really thoughtful about where it's about the law already calls for the services to be provided, and they're not being adequately provided to Coloradans with disabilities. And we may need to look at additional enforcement mechanisms or additional requirements for that. But Shanda, you're far more the expert on this. We shared the recommendations or the memo, as you saw. What background would you like to give folks? And then I'm hoping we can have about a 15-minute casual conversation, but I'll give you the floor.
Yeah, thank you. And this is Chanda, and I'll provide a quick little summary, knowing that I want to spend more time with, like you had said, having the committee discuss whatever capacity and appropriate to maybe more that service component of it. Because I realize that it could, yeah. So just yes to all the things you said, and I'll just jump right in. So for those that don't know, my name's Chanda. I'm the executive director of the Chanda Center for Health. And so I myself have a spinal cord injury, C5, C6. At our health clinic, we serve individuals with disabilities by providing them accessible and integrative healthcare. So it is very disability competent. In that environment, what we have identified, not only just from that clinic and my personal self, I know you all will identify with these pieces as well, but what we have identified is over the longevity of Medicaid and healthcare is that, one, it's hard to find providers that will take on individuals underneath Medicaid, those with disabilities, right? We know that when we get on Medicaid, we start looking for those primary care providers, and not all of them will either take one Medicaid, or if they do, they don't have a desire or ability to serve individuals with disabilities based on the accommodations that are required to serve that population, right? So some of these accommodations could be interpretation or interpreters, accessible buildings, offices, helping people transfer onto treatment tables, timely response to paperwork that's like for our ongoing Medicaid benefits, right? Our DME, our determinations that happen every year, our medications, and then also this like ongoing focus of annual prevention to our health versus us always having to be in our with our primary care only about our secondary conditions, right? It should be our ongoing healthcare as well as our secondary conditions. And so in speaking with stakeholders over the last 3 years, which this is not a new thing, this is a decade thing, this lack of support in compliance, I think not only within potentially what levels of enforcement or awareness that happens not only for our state entity, but then also what compliance or enforcement around the providers. Because one thing I will say is that providers absolutely, I think, want to serve. The barriers on it takes more time. They say that there's education that's not provided. They don't get paid for the paperwork. So there's a lot of these components that give providers this ability to say, well, because I don't get paid for those, that means that I'm not going to serve that individual, silently saying that, which then results in more health disparity for people, not getting proper care, going to the ER rather than utilizing our primary care. And it's just not equitable healthcare, right? Like that doesn't create equitable healthcare and further disparity within the population, which we are complex and we can cost a lot. So it's like, with that being said, I think the reason I wanted to bring it forth is because I feel like the task force overall, knowing there's various committees, right? I think this is an essential topic that needs to be shared, knowing that there could be things that we can address, or there might be things that we can address. But I think that if I had not brought it up, it would have been, I feel, inappropriate that I didn't bring up an issue that is very predominantly in the disability community around access to healthcare. And so, options, again, I'm going to really leave that to what this task force is really tasked with versus not. But I do think there's some accountability issues on whether that be directly with our state Medicaid agency, whether it's a combination state Medicaid agency along with the providers that they're contracted with that are getting federal and state funds. But that's an overall summary, and I'll stop there, given it is a very big conversation, right?
Thank you, Mary Chanda. And I'm going to bring in Councilman Hines first, just to set for everyone to set expectations. We'll spend the next 10, 15 minutes talking through this. I'm going to first invite folks to ask clarifying questions to make sure everyone is understanding what this current situation is and what maybe the levers of change are. We'll start the very high level conversation of how you might want to see this committee lean in on some ideas to address those barriers, where we might see the other committees, particularly the CADA rewrite, lean in on it. We will hold off until our next meeting to start formally generating ideas if you all decide that this is something this committee should address, because I don't want to rush it from introducing this to you today to asking you to generate really thoughtful ideas. So we'll have a start of the conversation today. I'll ask you to think about it between now and our next meeting, but we want to see where the group is with this. With that background, Councilman Hines, please do jump in, sir.
Yes, thank you. Chris Hines, Denver City Council. For some reason, my camera is not working right now, so I apologize. Chanda, question for you. While I hear that it's new for the committee, it's certainly not new for the community. And so question for you, my thought process is I have found a provider that is willing to take Medicare, Medicaid, and should it be part of the conversation that there are a few providers, it's Dr. Patricia Meyer at Denver Health, and she's willing to do the paperwork. She's willing to do the the other things that are necessary for someone with a spinal cord injury. I also have a spinal cord injury. The challenge is that because there are so few providers, she's swamped. And so it impacts her ability to provide primary care, and mostly she is addressing secondary, as you said, secondary diagnoses, and just doesn't have the opportunity to provide true attention to the primary diagnosis, as in the spinal cord injury. And so I wonder if that could be part of the conversation too. You're talking about the providers which is the vast majority of providers won't accept Medicare, Medicaid, or won't accept people with complex diagnoses. But on top of that, I wonder if the conversation could also be the few providers who say yes are also overwhelmed, and that's part of the issue with the system. Is that fair?
Is it okay if I respond? Yeah, absolutely, Chris, because we don't want just Patricia Myers to be the only one that's willing to serve people with disabilities as a Medicaid provider, right? Like every Medicaid provider, technically by law, should be serving people with disabilities. They don't have that ability to turn us away from care, right? And so, yes, I'm happy that we have the Patricia Myers in our community and the Barry Martins and some of those, but it's like that to me is an equitable healthcare issue under Medicaid that is not making a enforcement or audit or compliance to ensure that we get access to healthcare outside of those that just decide to like care, like they and so I think that's the deeper piece of it, right?
Yeah, thank you. And I don't have any particular suggestions about levers, but we're just introduced this right now. And so thank you for giving us the space to think about this before we start identifying and recommending levers, because I don't know. I mean, as an individual, I've thought about this for a long time. I don't know, as a subcommittee member, I don't know what tools we have in the toolbox other than maybe ensuring that there are reimbursements for that additional prep time, but at any rate, so thanks for providing the context. Thanks for giving us the time and the space to consider it before we really dive in. And that's all I have. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you, Councilman. And you two are hitting on exactly why, one, we felt it did make sense to bring to this committee, and two, why we thought that time would be necessary. It's, as Shanna and I talked about this, it's very complex, and we've got to find that lever and that role where we have agency as this task force. It's not our place to try to overhaul healthcare or Medicaid itself. We can't try to compel individual practitioners and medical providers to accept Medicaid, but we certainly have the ability to say what Colorado law is when you start playing in our sandbox as it relates to the rights of Coloradans to receive care, including and particularly Coloradans with disabilities. So we
can't make people work for free either.
Exactly. So we're gonna have to figure out that mix of sticks and carrots, incentives and compliance that might be possible here. Shannon, let me bring you in, sir.
Okay, hello. I am Shannon. I am a deaf person and I also have ADHD. I have two questions. The first one is about the Government Access Committee. So what I'm curious about is, I mean, we've talked a lot about struggles and in terms of like what providers to pick and that type of stuff. So I was wondering if the ADA has some sort of like proof or some sort of like written statement in there that can be applied to this. So like if there's like there's a section in the ADA where providers are ignoring the wording there and not following the law, that is something that we could look at, you know what I mean? So I was wondering if, hold on one second, the interpreter. Oh, so I was wondering if there is any sort of like grant or if there's any sort of like person with a disability who is able to, speak on that and give voice to that issue.
So as the facilitator, and Shannon, I'm going to bring you in. I will say, I don't have the answer, Shannon. Some of what you're raising is why we want to also bring this to the rewrite subcommittee that's looking at Colorado's laws and see if either they believe there's a place that the ADA is incorporated into Colorado law by reference that might address this, if our own law addresses it and it's not being complied with, or if we need to look at revisions or additional provisions in Colorado's law. Chanda, what is your take on that question of, is this in violation of something that already exists in the ADA, or is this some kind of a missed opportunity or loophole there?
It's believed amongst the disability advocates that yes, there is a potential violation of various components. And so Shannon, you spoke to it, right? There's so many different levers, and there's so many different, like, there's sections of the ADA, and then there's actually portions of Health and Human Services. There's who enforces it. It's a spider web of all of this. And we've been able to really identify language and contracts, right? But again, going back to what we've also said, we have to be mindful of what this committee can do and not do, knowing that whatever we may be able to identify, because I've been working on this for over quite 3 to 4 years. I've found all those little components, right? But now ensuring that we have the proper avenues to not let it fall off the radar, because it's a quarter of a century issue that it shouldn't continue to go on anymore. I think that's what I think there are opportunities. It's just, what can this committee do versus other committees under this task force, or what might have to happen outside of this task force. But I think we'd be happy to share more of that stuff with you at a later time, knowing that this is the first time we're bringing it up, right? And could dive into more of it if the committee so chooses to do so.
Shannon, your hand is still up. Does that just remain up from earlier?
Yeah, I just want to respond. So yes, I agree. And I think that the accessibility committee here has the opportunity. The question is just, how do we get it done? The ADA is supposed to, confirm that, yes, this is the law and it's not being followed. So that's a problem. And it's almost just like the government is kind of like turning a blind eye to it. They're not, it's almost like they think it's not their problem. And so I think the government, or I think really it should be more involved, so the ADA has it all laid out. So when you have doctors that are really overwhelmed like that, because they're the only ones who provide that type of service, we really need to be able to figure out how to get the rest of the providers to accept, and to follow and to comply with the ADA law, so that we're not experiencing that problem.
Thank you, Shannon. And to both of your points, the language creating this committee gives us fairly broad authority. It says we are to make recommendations on issues to ensure people with disabilities have access to the services they need. And what I'm hearing is there is a limitation and a barrier to people with disabilities receiving the services they need. So we will invite this. Just in terms of the sequencing, as I said at the top of the call, we talked about running for office. Today, we're going to talk about being employed in office. In our coming calls, we're going to move into the conversations about participating in public discussion and about accessing services. So the timing is perfect. I'm glad that Chanda reached out and nudged me to make sure we had this conversation. And as I'm listening, I'm going to make sure we also do bring this to the CATA Rewrite Subcommittee. Let me open it up to other members of this committee to see if you have questions about the situation that Chanda outlined, and about the role of state government, whether it's HCPF, Medicaid, Medicare, or the private sector providers, and where we may have the opportunity to influence. But I want to make sure as I ask everyone to think about this over the next few weeks, that everyone is fairly clear about what the situation is.
And I don't mean to call anyone out, but Craig, I really want to know from CPW, D, like I and you also, I'd really love to hear from you if you're willing.
This is Craig. Yeah, thank you so much. And this is a topic that we're very interested in and want to discuss. I think before we can give any opinion, we'll need to do a little bit more research on it and just think about it a little bit more critically and then come back with a response. But it's definitely something that we should prioritize and incorporate in the work we do.
Yep. And I think the memo that we added, just so you guys know, we had, there wasn't a memo that was attached because we've asked HICPUF to do a little bit of research on the topic because there's all, I mean, them even understanding the components of ADA versus their authority versus jurisdiction, all these things, it's like, it's very interesting. So I think that's going to be helpful as well. And then whatever additional information you all might think would be beneficial to dive deeper into it, that could be at a later time to then share.
Well, I'm not seeing other questions right now. I know we shared this for the first time today. It's a lot of information and a really complex situation with so many different players involved. If after today's call you have additional questions or you have resources that you think should be considered, send them by email to Carrie or to me. We'll get with Chanda and we'll also make sure we distribute those across all of the members. But based on what I'm hearing, it sounds like this committee does want to consider potentially developing some ideas around this. So we will include this system into our conversation when we get to the conversation about ideas relating to people accessing the services they need. Chanda, does that work for you? And I'm going to recruit you to join the rewrite committee for a conversation as well.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Perfect.
Thank you everyone for letting me share, and back to our normal business.
Thank you for bringing it to us. I'm going to do a quick review of what we discussed for running for and serving in office, not because we're going to revisit all of it, but I want to make sure as we were talking about some of the barriers to one type of work in government, of being in elected office, we frame some of our discussion and that helps us think of things when it comes to being employed, although there will be many more issues there, I'm sure. I will also remind now and at the end of the call, these ideas that I'm about to read through are now all up on the Engage Dora website. And we really do not only want, but we need your help sharing those ideas with your networks and with organizations or communities that you have connections with so that we can get feedback from the public. Before I do that, I see Shanda's hand up. Shanda? No? Okay. I will also just say very briefly, I know we've asked you to be on a 2-hour call. That's a lot to sit still. So at approximately 11 o'clock, I'm going to give us all a 5-minute break to whether it's grab water, get rid of water, grab a bite, whatever you need to do. We'll take a quick break at the top of the hour. I'm going to read pretty quickly through the running for and serving in elected office ideas, because I'm only providing these as background to spark your thinking as I'll then start the conversation about being employed. The ideas that this group came up with started with requiring that any venue or facility being used for campaign events, in fact, be ADA compliant. And we added some ideas in there to make sure that it is checked, that they don't just get to say, yes, we're compliant, that someone actually checks to make sure that they are compliant. You also raised the idea of requiring anybody who holds an election to designate an individual or an office that serves as the ADA compliance officer for that jurisdiction. We talked about requiring every jurisdiction in Colorado to have an employee whose sole position is serving as ADA coordinator, and where they may be a smaller jurisdiction to allow them to serve in multiple capacities, but not in ones that were conflicting, such as being the risk coordinator or risk management coordinator. You presented the idea of directing the Secretary of State to establish a single and fully accessible multi-format resource outlining all the election and campaign processes and requirements, also requiring the Secretary of State to develop and maintain a guide of ADA and Colorado compliance requirements for accessibility, as well as for best practices. We also are floating the idea of directing the Secretary of State to develop and require the statewide use of a secure and fully accessible means of electronically gathering signatures for getting on the ballot or putting issues on the ballot. And finally, under the running for office, your idea was to require any political party nominating candidates in Colorado's that any vendors they use, and we were talking about software in particular, be fully accessible and compliant. We had a handful of ideas also once you win office and you're serving in office, again requiring that all software or services necessary to fulfill that elected office be fully accessible, or that an alternative be provided that is, requiring that the state and every city or town in Colorado provide an easy to access platform for constituent video participation in meetings with the elected officials that are open to the public. Next, it was presented that we require any modification to any government building, regardless of the change of use or not, to include the modifications necessary for the building to be fully ADA compliant. Idea number 4 under serving in office was to include a demographic note to be added to any bill addressing the rights and ability of a Coloradan with a disability to run for or serve in office. And just to provide some reminder on that, there's the ability to add certain designations of certain classes of constituents, but they are limited in number, and they are the rights of Coloradans with disabilities are limited there. So you wanted to add that note. Last 2 you presented. Number 1 was establish a timeline of not more than 5 years within which the state would be required to ensure the availability of an audio and wayfinding program that allows a person who is blind or visually impaired to navigate the state capitol building. And finally, related to the individual serving in the state legislature, require that the House of Representatives and the Senate provide auxiliary aids and services to any member of the General Assembly upon request. So it's a lot. We've already spent a couple meetings on those, and those are now on the website. But because some of these things, like modifications to buildings, accessibility software, may apply to our next conversation, I wanted to review them. Our topic for today, and as I've said many times, we're not generating formal proposals. You may suggest multiple ideas to solve the same problem. You may offer some ideas that are competing with one another. It's entirely up to you. The intent is to put ideas out in front of the public to get as much stakeholder input and feedback as possible to inform the recommendations you all will ultimately put together. And today's conversation then is going to be about being employed by government agencies. And when we think about government agencies, I will ask you to think very broadly, from the smallest town to the state government, and in any agency or office of any of those city, town, county, or state governments. And as I said at the very top of the call, I'll invite you to offer ideas on the entire spectrum of being employed, which probably starts with finding out about the jobs, where jobs are posted. It may be about the application process, what's included. It may be about the interview process. Once someone is hired, then it would be about the onboarding and the starting the job process, and then everything that may come with serving in that employed position. So with that, I will generally leave it to folks to raise their hands, but you know me, and if someone doesn't raise their hand, I will raise it for you and make sure everyone is in this conversation. Who would like to jump in first with ideas of what are some of the ways we may want to address barriers to issues related to applying for, interviewing for, being hired, and working in government? Craig, jump in, please.
Hello, this is Craig. I can kick us off with a few ideas that I was thinking about. I think first and foremost, it'll be important to really go over and update the current anti-discrimination policies that are available to make sure that the language is current and addressing everything and up to date with the current times. I think we should have requirements for hiring people with disabilities for certain positions where we would prioritize and incentivize hiring people with disabilities. I think we need to make sure that the recruitment channels are diverse and we utilize community partners and organizations to help share the job opportunities to make sure it's actually getting into the disability community so people can apply. And then again, some things that are borrowing from our previous work, of course, are the accessible technologies and accessible facilities as well. And then I think as far as for hiring practices, we need to have more inclusive job descriptions and then remove unnecessary barriers in those job descriptions, such as unnecessary prerequisites, as well as showing that we're valuing lived experience is really important, and use that as a prerequisite for a job as a type of experience, as opposed to focusing a lot on kind of paper ceiling academic criteria, but really valuing lived experience for roles where that can be a benefit to encourage diversity of thought. And then disability etiquette training, I think, should be required for all employees, especially in leadership positions and for hiring managers. And those are the main ones, just a few.
Great. And I'm going to dig a little more into each of these with you. Chanda, were you raising your hand to react to one of his or to add additional ideas?
Add.
Okay, let me get to you in just a minute. I want to make sure that I'm clarifying enough that we can draft some ideas to share. I've got your first idea around hiring people with disabilities for certain positions. And I think I know what you mean, but I want to make sure. Are we talking about ensuring that those who are working on issues related to interfacing with people with disabilities, we prioritize hiring for individuals with lived experience?
This is Craig. That's part of it, but I do think that we need to create an environment that's welcoming and incentivizes hiring managers to want to hire people with disabilities, to really value that diversity of thought and the benefit that we bring to all workplaces. And I think the only way to kind of even the playing field is to have an incentive process, because I think with the internalized and systemic ableism within our systems, unless we have some sort of incentive or requirement in these hiring processes, people with disabilities just aren't going to be hired as frequently as not, and that's just due to a lot of the internalized ableism that exists, and we have to deconstruct, and we have to start by providing incentives and requirements to help get that going.
Great. Let me just follow up a little bit on that, because I want to be very clear as we start to draft something that reflects your thinking. Is your idea, Craig, that this becomes part of overall DEI efforts in hiring and in agency culture, or are we singling out, and I don't mean that in a negative way, are we calling out specifically different incentives or a focused energy on ensuring there's additional prioritization for hiring individuals with disabilities?
I would say both.
Okay.
And I also think we should do a push to expand DEI to DEIA and add accessibility onto it.
Great. Thank you very much. And understand, I'm going to ask some questions that may seem silly, may seem elementary or obvious. It's because I want to make sure I'm not assuming anything about what your ideas are. I'm going to go to Chanda and then to Shannon.
This is Chanda. It would be helpful for us if we could also just see what's currently laid out as what is currently required of employees around this, to then be able to understand what we might want to recommend or propose, just because I think that I'm not 100% sure that I'm clear on all of that. And knowing that that could be a great foundation of change or recommendation. The piece for me that comes up is I know that when it comes to the accommodations, I have seen across the board that sometimes it's either the employee, it's either the individual, or it's either tapping into DVR, right? And so for the funding of some of those accommodations. And so I guess for me, I don't want people to not get employment because employers from the very beginning think, well, upon hiring this person, then I've got to do all of these accommodations that then have this price tag to it. And which is not okay anyways, but I do think that understanding where that price tag, where the responsibility lies, and I don't know if there is even some sort of, based on amount, does it rely, where does it land basically? And so I think that's really important for us to try to understand in order to propose something that could be a bit more less scary on the employer and more supportive to the employee. So that would be my, I'd love to see more around that and maybe recommendations based on what it is now and what it should be.
Chanda, let me stay on that one for a minute. And Craig, I don't know if you were raising your hand in response to that. You are, so I may bring you in before I bring Shannon in. When we spoke about this, and Chanda, to your point, I know we brought in a few different folks from the state and from the city and county to talk about their approaches. What we heard was everyone really says they're well-intentioned, but the lived experience seemed to have been much different. On the point you just raised, I'm remembering a conversation we had that, to your point about employing or hiring managers being hesitant because of the cost. And at the time, I think it was our April meeting, someone raised the idea of, should there be a pool of funds or a budget that is outside the agency budget to provide for the cost of those accommodations, so that that hiring manager didn't look at it as a hit to their office, their department, or their agency's budget. And I'm neither advocating or advocating for or against that, but I would love your thoughts on that and how that would look at the state level. Maybe there's a state pool of funds that any state agency uses for accommodations. What is that an idea we should be discussing, and how might we apply that at the city or the county level?
Yeah, and I think that's a great idea. I mean, I think that I think there should be several options. I don't think that we should put all of the onus on the state. I do think that there should be some level of a support and accountability from the employee, right? But to what extent, I think that's what I think trying to articulate, meaning like, is the dollar amount when we tap into potentially state funds, because the dollar amount of the accommodation is so much that there's no way. So I think that there could be different levels to which, like, where does it land based on the cost of and complexity of the accommodation, right? I think that's a place that can start delineating on who's the responsibility, knowing that I do believe that we should have employers having their skin in the game too, because it's like, I don't want them to not have any level of skin in the game. So yeah, and I know that's not what you're recommending, but I do think that there's a variety of it, right? There could be some there could be the employer, there could be a state pool, and then at this time we do have DVR that does some of that stuff too. So it's like, to what extent then do we have another set aside of funds to accommodate outside of what DVR, knowing that some people get bogged down in the DVR process, knowing that sometimes to just get, like, we had somebody that needed a specialized keyboard or mouse, and it took like close to 6-12 months. And that's a little bit too slow when somebody's ready to get employment with a disability and needed one very affordable accommodation, but yet that time frame was way, it wasn't going to work for the individual. So then they lost their employment.
I'm going to bring Craig in. I'm also going to try to parse this out. Our committee is talking about employment with a government or government agency. These ideas also would apply, or the challenge certainly exists in the private sector, in the nonprofit sector, among small businesses. So as we develop ideas, we may want to suggest for government. Feel free also to offer ideas that you want me to take to the rewrite committee, who is looking at the basic accommodations provisions of the Anti-Discrimination Act.
Yep. Thank you for that clarity, and I apologize, but yes, I
No,
do.
not at all.
I mean, I do think that it applies beyond, and so that would be great to add it to that.
Craig, you had your hand up and we just kept going. Let me bring you in and then Shannon.
This is Craig. Yeah, this will be really quick, and this is just in response to what Shanda was saying, and I really agree that there is a stigma of hiring people with disabilities, kind of going back to the whole concept of public charge and how people with disabilities can be a burden and cost too much, and that's a disincentive. And that's where I think the idea of offering incentives and requirements can really help combat that, because if there is requirements, then you can't use the excuse that it costs too much, because it's built into the policy that you have to hire. And then also incentivizing by providing funding from wherever to make sure that the additional costs are not in the conversation or decision making for that person's hire. So I think we were kind of thinking of the same barrier in the beginning, and I think by having it in policy that there's requirements for certain hiring practices, and then costs will already be alleviated through some sort of fund or incentive for doing that, can kind of help take care of that initial barrier. That's all.
Great. Thank you, Craig. I'm going to go to Shannon and then Karen, and I'm going to push everyone after Shannon and Karen to really think about the front half of the working for government half. And that is the knowing that there's jobs. That is the applying for jobs. That's the interviewing. Let's spend maybe the next 10 minutes plus some time after the break on that. And then we'll spend some time in the back half really digging into what are the ideas that will make it less problematic for an individual or less challenging for an individual with a disability to actually work. So we'll split it into that front half and back half. But Shannon and Karen, I invite you to speak about whatever is on your mind about working for government. Shannon, you first.
No worries. This is Shannon here. I've got a couple things, so I'm trying to catch up. So you mentioned the incentives, and from what I remember, the federal level should have some sort of tax write-off or discounts or some sort of thing for people with disabilities, so for accommodations. And I think we might need to really improve the attention that we're making to these types of decisions. So hold on one second for the interpreter. Oh, okay. So yeah, so it really just kind of paying attention to that and focusing on ideas for how to get that improved. I also wanted to say that I like the idea of changing the DEI to DEIA. I thought that was a cool idea. And then sorry for the interpreter. And so, yeah, so we do want to make sure we're focusing on inclusion, but we also want to make sure accessibility, right? So that's what we're talking about. And technically, technically adding like inclusion, or the inclusion part, is really that it goes along with it. So it's all kind of related, making sure people are included as well as accommodated. And then another point that I wanted to make was about training. And so I have a lot of experience really having to fight against the barriers that the systems have in terms of interviews. A lot of times, you know, the interviewees don't know even how to address or facilitate an interview with people with disabilities. So that is also something that we need to brainstorm about, and how we get that kind of, how we get that barrier a little bit lessened. And a lot of times, like, the problem is in it is like a system problem. They people might say, people with a disability might be like deleted from the system because, you know, they were unable to be accommodated. So they're just kind of almost like left aside, kind of. So that was kind of my couple of thoughts. Sorry, I went through them really fast. I know I was trying to catch up on everything.
No, I appreciate it, Shannon, and that is one of the many reasons Carrie has the note taker plugged into this meeting, so we capture all of the ideas. So bring as many as you would like to. Karen, let me bring you in.
Thanks. I really love all the ideas so far. I want to also bring up, I think we need to build in some training into this process. I know at the municipal level, we're still struggling with people coming in for interviews for even for boards and commissions. So not a full-time job, but a volunteer job. And, you know, of course, it's asked if they need accommodation, but we still have people come in that have, you know, maybe they wear hearing aids. And they struggle to be able to hear people asking them questions. And it's very frustrating for them. It's very frustrating for the electeds to feel like we're not giving them the correct accommodations. We just had this happen last week where a gentleman came in to interview and he couldn't hear anybody asking the questions. And they didn't have something ready to go in the room to help. And so, you know, it's got to be something that people may not be comfortable asking for, but the cities and the municipalities have to be ready to have them ready to go in the room, no matter what, instead of expecting someone to ask for it before they get there. So that's one thing I wanted to bring up. The other thing I wanted to bring up that I think I mentioned a long time ago is in the application process from the very beginning, when they ask if you have a disability. And one of the things I asked about that is, does that help you get hired if we have some type of ask, like you need to hire this percentage of people with disabilities? Is that part of what our planning calls for? Or does it hinder you in getting hired? And I think that's something that I'd like to know. I'm sure we all would. But you know, why is that question asked, and what's the reason for it in terms of getting you hired?
And Karen, I appreciate you raising those questions. I will go back and check both with the state office that oversees it, as well as some of the HR offices, human resources offices within individual agencies. I believe there is some of the personally identifiable information that is recorded when it comes in, but is stripped away before that application or resume gets to the hiring manager. Okay. But on these specific things, I don't know the answer. So let me get some answers for you. I also think it's fair for this group to consider that. There have certainly been changes in private sector corporate hiring processes to avoid unconscious bias or intentional discrimination by removing things like names or education institutions or extracurricular activities or what boxes were checked. So I would open it up to this group that you have the opportunity to offer ideas where good practices may be in place, but great practices may not be required. So I think there's an opening for all of you. Craig, I see your hand up, and we'll continue this conversation for probably another 5 minutes, and then we'll take a break.
And I do just want to say, I think that we do have to have some accommodations or giving some amount of dollars to each of these organizations from a government side of things in order to offer accommodations. But we also need to find a way to make it where they have to have them and they have to offer them, not just by somebody asking for it, but it should just be there. So I want that to be part of the legislation.
Understood, and I've got that idea captured, and I know Carrie does as
Thanks.
well. Great, and I'm gonna bring Craig in. Rob, it is good to see you. Just so you know where we are talking about ideas, generating ideas relating to working for government offices, government agencies. We're using the first part of this conversation to talk about what might be some ideas addressing what I'm calling the front end of finding out about jobs, where jobs are posted, how they're posted, the interview process. After we take a break in a few minutes, we're going to talk about what are some ideas to address barriers once you get hired. Right now, it's everything before someone gets hired. Craig, what's on your mind?
This is Craig. I think to kind of help what you were referring to, Karen, would be to implement some more transparency within the hiring practices and maybe incorporate some sort of public reporting on hiring demographics that would be anonymous, but be clear to the public who is applying, the demographics of who's applying for jobs and who's getting hired, and have to publicly report on that to hold our agencies accountable for the hiring practices. And then just with, I really agree with all the recommendations for increased training, especially disability etiquette training, but I think we need to be really specific about that training. And whenever that's talked about, we need to really make it clear that it needs to be the people leading the training need to be people with disabilities with lived experience. It can't be outsourced to some consultant that comes in with a PowerPoint. It needs to be community and stakeholder led training.
Thank you, Craig. And I've got that captured, and we'll make sure we develop some ideas to share back out with you. Today, I just want to remind, today is the brainstorming side of this. Then we'll try to clean this up into a set of ideas to share back with you to discuss. We're not going to try to get this perfect on today's call, but we'll get ideas on the table. Rob or Chanda, do either of you want to offer ideas for consideration on this front half? Everything from the minute the job description is being written up. We've had things about really revisiting what are prerequisites, whether that's lift 50 pounds or have these degrees and these credentials, giving a careful eye to the prereqs. We've talked about being intentional about the diversity of platforms where these jobs are posted. And we've talked about what accommodations should be required to be just available when it comes to interviewing. But Rob, let me go to you first and then Chanda for ideas around this front half of getting hired and finding out about the job and getting hired.
Oh, well, I don't know. I mean, I'd have to really process and think about what you're asking more than just on the spot, right?
Fair enough.
But I mean, there's at the city, we use a thing called, oh boy, I can't even get my thoughts together today. I was part of that whole computer thing that went down. So anyway, yeah, I'll have to come back.
Quite all right. Quite all right.
Thanks.
Chanda, anything coming to mind for you?
It's just Chanda. I feel like everything has been really well covered in summary. I do think, again, the expectations and setting them set forth to those within government positions to ensure that they have a level of like overall disability competence, which means all of these things that we just talked about, right? Like training. I like how Craig said it's, folks with lived experience. I also wonder if there's a way in which, some of that, I mean, this is kind of going into the little weeds a little bit, but like even the ability to have a standard training module that is vetted, that allows for lived experience individuals to that's what has to, and that might have to be updated over time, but given whatever ability of changes can occur from this committee's overall task force around this, I think that in order for there to be a level of sustainability, I do think that whatever online or video modules on that training in order for one, it to be consistent, right? That we're not losing from individuals coming in and doing the training. I think it's got to be very robust. And I just think of like adult learning. It's a whole thing. It's a whole thing, right? It's like, but I do think that we need to be mindful of like, how do we sustain that level of training that's consistent, coming from the disability population, or, you know, folks with disability and the lived experience, that's not going to then give any one department within the government to say, oh, well, we didn't have the time to organize lived experience people to come in and do the training today. You know what I mean? It's almost like we've got to make it so it's really readily available and easy for them as too.
Thanks, Shanda. I appreciate that. Councilman Hines, before we take a break, do you have any ideas you want to put on the table? We've spent in the spring talking about the barriers to finding out about jobs, applying for them, what the job requirements are, and the interviews. Any ideas you'd like to offer, put on the table?
So I apologize. I had technical issues. Camera's on now. So I missed a little bit of our conversation as I was, so I don't have anything right now, but thank you for the offer.
It's quite all right. We're at 11:05 right now. Why don't we give everyone, let's call it 10 minutes, but when I say 10, it means the conversation is really starting back up at 11:15. So if I can give everyone the next 10 minutes to take a break, to take care of whatever you need to, or just to stop staring at a screen with me, we'll start back up promptly at 11:15. For those listening but hiding from camera, this is Barrick. Clock is at 11:13. We will start in 2 minutes at 11:15 promptly. We'll resume the conversation. Okay, I promised a return to conversation at 11:15. Here we are. Everybody's popping back on. Thank you very much. Really appreciated that conversation. And I'm just going to run through some of my rough notes. If you had an idea and I don't reference it, be assured that Carrie and Carrie's note taker have caught absolutely everything. It's the brilliance of having not only an incredibly talented colleague, but an incredibly talented colleague who went out and found the right AI note taker to make sure we never miss anything. But among some of the things that I heard as we were talking about that front end of where jobs are shared, what the application process and the hiring is, one was ensuring that we hire people with disabilities for some positions, both those where having that lived experience is directly relevant and some where it is not even. Chenda, did you want to jump in now or once I get through this?
I can't wait till you get through.
Okay. And on that note, Josh reminded me during the break that CDLE, in fact, has a disability hiring preference that's modeled after the veteran hiring preferences. So we may invite Caitlin or someone from CDLE to talk about that. You raised the ideas of making sure we use diverse and appropriate platforms to share those jobs and extend those the reach of that. Removing unnecessary prerequisites and placing a clear value on lived experience. The idea of making sure we're providing disability adequate training for leadership positions and for hiring managers. We had a pretty good conversation around accommodations and where those intersect with the hiring decision itself. And the need to find some funding pools, some incentives, and to make sure that that's not used as a disincentive, the need to provide accommodations. So we talked about both incentives and requirements. Shannon raised the question about the availability of federal funds. And I believe there may be some limits. So Shannon, we're going to get some answers about that. I think it's refundable tax credits that can be applied to local governments. So that might be an option there, and we'll look into that some more. Also made, Karen raised the suggestion or the idea in making sure that resources are available during interviews, not just when they're requested, but that there's a standing availability. We also had the idea of just adding transparency to what the applicant pool looks like compared to who ends up getting hired. And I know there were more ideas in there. That's just some of what I captured in addition to what I know Carrie did. I want to shift the conversation. We're going to spend the next 30-ish minutes talking about ideas for resolving the barriers and challenges once hired. And for that, let's think about it from the moment of hire. So the onboarding process, the training process, and everything involved in fulfilling those duties. And I'd like you to think not just about filling the duties, but the career path and ensuring that career advancement and growth is part of this consideration and it's available equally and equitably. Chanda, let me get you in with whatever's on your mind, and then I'm going to start getting everybody into the conversation.
Yeah, this is Chanda. I was just going to add, which it may have already been said, but and this kind of goes through the whole process prior to hire and then hire, but technology in the sense of making sure that applications are accessible and can be filled out in a way that I don't know that that was added or mentioned. So I do think that we need to be thinking about technology all the way through, knowing that yes, it has another layer of potential expense, but most individuals will have some of their own, they'll have their own devices because they'll use them in other capacities throughout their life. But I do want to be aware of the variances between what level of technology to accommodate accessibility from applying to then now going into hiring. And yeah, so that's it.
Thanks, Chanda. Councilman Hines.
Yeah, thank you. Chris Hines, Denver City Council. Two things, hopefully I remember them both. The first is a bit of a feedback loop. So hopefully allowing people, so just as we have this conversation, hopefully as employers hire more people with disabilities, they realize that we're not weird animals. The fear of the unknown, I think hopefully could be addressed, because I think that some people make hiring decisions where they don't want to hire someone with a disability. They cook something else up. They make obviously that would be discrimination, but they find some other reason not to hire someone. But the underlying cause is because they don't know what to do with someone with a disability, and they're afraid they're going to screw something up. So hopefully there's a bit of a feedback loop there. The second thing I wanted to share is there are subject matter experts that can help employers with that unknown. So I worked for a company, private for-profit company, when I had my crash. And so I was able-bodied, and then I was not. I had a spinal cord injury. This is the only protected class that anyone can join at any time, whether you like it or not. And so here I am. So I went from being a runner and on 3 soccer teams and working in finance for a software company to going to Craig Hospital for a few months. My employer said, "We want you back. As long if you ever want a job back at work, at my employer, whoever it may be, that you're welcome here." And so I went back to work full time. I took a month off after rehab, but I went back to work full time. And one of the services that Craig Hospital offered was some case managers to come on site to where I worked to suggest areas, items of reasonable accommodation. And so the requests for accommodation were pretty minor. I mean, I was working at a desk, sitting down all day. Well, guess what? I can't move my legs at all, so my wheelchair has me sitting down all day. So the requests were pretty minor, and frankly were OSHA. There was a little bit of OSHA non-compliance. So really anyone should have had a desk that was at a different height than where it was. So making sure that employers have access to experts that can help take that unknown into known, I think would be helpful, or at least so that employers know that there are subject matter experts there out and available. Does that make sense? And then second, these subject matter experts came out to Craig. Craig said, "Oh, that's a great." Out to my experts from Craig went to my employer, and the employer said, "That's great." And then once I actually showed up, they put me totally different spot, far away from my team. And they said, "Well, it's because it's close to the door." But I was in finance. Every other member of the finance team was on the other side of the building. So it incredibly attenuated my ability to work with my colleagues. And they were not interested in any, having me rejoin my my team. And so this is the team that I worked for before as an able-bodied individual. So maybe that I don't know why that happened. Is that because of the fear of the unknown? Because someone told them that he needs to be closest to the exit? I don't know, but so this is, hopefully just one, outlier. I don't know, but from my own personal experience, having those experts available, I think would make a lot of sense to employers because they have a fear of the unknown. Also, having employers trust that those experts know what they're doing would also be helpful. So, I mean, that's a personal experience, but I have interviewed for jobs. This job is a little different, but before I got elected, I interviewed for jobs, and it seemed to me pretty clear that they made stuff up and just didn't want to hire me because I use a wheelchair to get around.
Krista, if I could keep you in this conversation for a minute, and I want to think through, we're talking about government jobs, but it's a different beast, whether it's working at HICPUF or DOLA, one of the big state agencies, or working for the zoning office in the city of Ouray. And I'm curious, what do you think we might be able to float as ideas here? Is it ensuring that part of training for all hiring managers in state agencies is training around how to network with these subject matter experts? Is it providing a designated contact in state and larger governments? How could we get at this in a mix of statutory, regulatory incentives and best practices that work for the largest government office and the small one?
Yeah, great point. So having the subject matter experts, so like in the city of Denver, we have the Office of Disability Rights. It's a really small office, and that office also reviews all plans that are presented to the office. The architectural plans for potential structures that might be built or renovated in the city that are presented. So that's a bit of an issue too, that some plans are not presented to the Office of Disability Rights, and then there are things that aren't accessible that go through from a zoning or planning perspective. But from an employment perspective, I think that there could be a similar issue where there might not be the staffing or the bandwidth available in an office that could theoretically be those subject matter experts. So one thought is to somehow make sure that there are subject matter experts available, and there's funding and staffing for those subject matter experts, so that they can provide that resource. Because I don't think our Office of Disability Rights does disability employment or hiring. So I don't know who that would be. I mean, I guess the OHR, Office of Human Resources, but is that in some ways, I think the Office of Human Resources might go against the idea of nothing about us without us. So ensuring that a office that is focused on disability rights has a role in the Human Resources Office, but yet is a disability rights office. I think that might be interesting. Funding might be interesting. I know that I also, after my crash, I applied for Schedule A jobs, which are federal positions. I would not get a response at all. So the government was opening up a Denver branch of the U.S. Patent Trade Office, USPTO, and it's downtown. It's a role that requires a technical degree. I have a computer science degree. I applied through Schedule A. Never got a response from anyone from HR or from USPTO. So that's another thing that we'd want to do, is have some sort of audit or a way to determine Schedule A sure sounds great on paper, but if it doesn't work in practice, then it's useless. So if I think there should be some kind of auditing, regular auditing of of our government processes. So one other example, so we have the Americans with Disabilities Act has laws regarding parking for people with disabilities. Our Denver has no inventory of accessible parking spaces in the city, city owned or private owned. So how do we know that the city of Denver is compliant with parking for people with disabilities? We can't even audit it if we don't have an inventory at all. So to apply this to employment, if maybe we should also statewide have just a regular study of the people with disabilities in employment in government, local, state positions. Just see what it is.
Thank you, Councilman. I appreciate you letting me probe on that. And I know today, we're not trying to get it perfect, but I hope as we iterate on these ideas, we're going to capture this at high levels and share it when we talk next. And then we'll start refining these into ideas that folks would like to share. And one of our members of the public shared with Carrie, the Job Accommodation Network, who provides consultants as a free expert and confidential guidance around some of these issues. So we'll share that resource and we can continue to talk about it. While it's fantastic that someone's providing that, what role should government do to ensure that that's always available to all individuals? Let me go to Rob. Sir, what is on your mind about what are some of the ideas we can put forward to remove some of the barriers and challenges once someone is hired to work for a government office?
So I don't know if you've already talked about this, if I'm behind the power curve here, but at the city, let me take my hand down real quick here. One of the things that we do here at the city, Colorado Springs, is we started this way back several years ago. We went to this thing called Spark Hire. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. And we noticed, okay, well, step one, it's not accessible. So we worked with the vendor to make it accessible because it's online, right? And what we do is we send this to applicants that we've chosen, and we give them so many questions and they record themselves. And so we have no idea if they're disabled or not. Okay, and then they just answer the questions and we see how they present themselves, how well they answer the questions, and then we decide if we're gonna go, okay, these 3 out of 6 were really good. Let's go ahead and move them forward to another interview, let's say, an actual interview, excuse me, where we might have 10 questions, right? And even then it's on Teams, okay? So we don't know. The thing is, I guess what I'm trying to say, Councilman Hines mentioned it, and it's unfortunate that a lot of times people will become interested and then all of a sudden they find out, oh, that person's disabled. I don't know, and it's unfortunate because they don't realize that person might be the best thing that's in sliced bread. Okay, but they're automatically thinking that, well, this person has a disability, may not work out. They start thinking all this crazy stuff, right? So we try to take that out of that equation. Okay, and then if that person's hired, oh, guess what? We just hired this person and this person is disabled. Okay, now it's our duty, our responsibility to provide reasonable accommodation if needed. And that's where it's a one-on-one conversation, us, the employer, with that individual to make that happen. I will say that even in HR where I work, there's a good handful of persons with disabilities. We have a variety of gender, a variety of everything you can imagine when it comes to civil rights. It's very, very progressive and everybody gets along great. We work together. And what's great about that is we draw on each other. We draw because a lot of people come from areas where they're very good at what they do and they have subject matter expertise. And when it comes to some of our persons with disabilities, we'll draw on them because in situations where it might be something mobility, okay, and we'll ask that question. Hey, include them in the meeting. What do you think about this? Oh, no, it doesn't work that way. And they educate us. They're like, oh, heck, we never thought about that. But they also go back, Councilman Hines had mentioned the HR department, right? So Title I is employment, and they're actually responsible for making sure that a person is educated and trained in that area, okay? And that's, even though I'm Title II, we do overlap. We help Title I sometimes. We conversate back and forth, okay? And then as far as the knowing and I'm trying to answer some questions. Hopefully I'm not out of place here, Councilman. But like the sidewalks and things like that, as far as that's required to be evaluated. It's called a self-evaluation. And Title II, the ADA office, I think Deborah calls it the disability or office or human rights or something like that, the disability office. But they're responsible for ensuring that a self-evaluation is done of the entire city. And that's put into a transition plan. So that's what we've done. So we do know how many sidewalks we have that are, we're evaluating all our sidewalks right now. But we do know we got over 38,000 ramps. So we know what's good and what's not good, okay? And that goes into the evaluation for the transition plan. So we do know that. And if you don't know, you're required to. Okay, whether you hire somebody to do it for you or you do it yourself. We decided to do it ourselves because we want to own it. Okay, but anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to start calling some people into this conversation. Craig. Well, Craig, you're going to get a moment to think. I'm going to come and ask you about your experiences and ideas of where there are specific things we can take action on through the lens of what state government barriers may exist. But Councilman Hines, to you first.
Thank you, Chris Hines, Denver City Council. Rob, thanks. It's great to see that you're still providing advocacy. So thanks for your continued commitment. So sidewalks, the city of Denver is in a settlement agreement with the Department of Justice that was signed in 2017. And so we have, as part of that settlement agreement, has set aside $10 million a year to install curb ramps all over our city. So we do have an inventory of curb ramps because that's part of the settlement agreement. As far as parking spaces, parking for people with disabilities, that wasn't part of the settlement agreement. It was actually part of our auditor's audit that came out in August of 2016. He recommended that we come up with an inventory, a citywide inventory of accessible parking spaces, because how will we know if they're compliant if we don't even know where they are or what they look like, or even a representative sample? And so that was the auditor's recommendation in August of 2016, which is before I was elected. The city said it would do it. Here we are nearly a decade later, and we have nothing. So I hear what you're saying about curb ramps. We do have an inventory of it. Wouldn't it be great if we had an inventory of parking spaces like we have an inventory of curb ramps? Thank you.
Thanks, Councilman. Rob, I'm going to bring you back in for 2 minutes because I see your hand up. And then before we get to public comment time, I am going to invite Craig, Karen, Chanda, and Shannon to all weigh in on this. But Rob, what's on your mind?
So real quick, Councilman Hines. So we're talking about all parking lots to include parking lots that are owned by businesses, or are we talking about parking lots that are owned by the municipality?
If you may, I'm not sure this works to the stakeholder group. I'm happy to talk about it all day, but I'll leave it to the facilitator. We could probably talk about it outside of this committee.
Okay. I got some ideas on that, so.
I appreciate the interest, and I am going to invite you guys to talk about that one offline. I want to keep us really focused on what are the issues that intersect with an individual being able to be employed by a government or government agency. Craig, let me bring you in, and then Karen, Chanda, and Shannon, you're all on deck.
This is Craig. Yeah, just a quick thought on what Rob was talking about with the responsibilities of Title I and Title II ADAs or requirements. I think in order for all this to work better, we need to have more enforcement for ADA, for Title I and Title II centers, because with the advocacy work that we do, we're constantly dealing with infractions within what is required by Title I and Title II centers, and a misunderstanding of what they're supposed to provide and how that actually is coming across for individuals, if that makes sense. So, and then the fix is really slow and there's not really a straightforward way to get this corrected. And I think in relation to a workplace, it would be essential to have some sort of mechanism that triggers an enforcement with a realistic timeline of the fix, or else it would make the employee unable to do their job. And then just a few other things. I know, Eric, you had mentioned this previously, but I think it's really important as well for people with disabilities to be provided with opportunities for upward mobility within the employment system. And I think there needs to be some sort of mentorship program established within the organizations to help foster this environment for upward mobility and career pathways within. And those are kind of underdeveloped ideas, but I think that's what I'd like to dive more into.
I appreciate it, and we welcome all half-baked, fully baked, or underdeveloped ideas. I want to get all ideas on the table, and we'll continue to refine them. Karen, let me invite you into the conversation, and then Chanda and Shannon, I'll come to both of you.
Thanks. I'm going to agree with Craig that we not only need training, but we need some form of enforcement. Those are really important activities. I just want to go back to making sure that we are offering some kind of incentive for hiring people with disabilities, and then having some kind of funding available.
Chanda, what are you thinking about when it comes to, from the moment someone is hired, whether it's onboarding, career path opportunities, or just job standard job duties? Where might the state want to lean in?
Well, what keeps coming up for me, and I don't know, there could be several ways around this, because I don't know that there's necessarily a I don't think there's definitely not a requirement of it. So, so I'm going to share it for the sake of it. It's coming up to me, but I don't know that I'd love to hear what other folks have to say about it, because I think about, and I know like Josh probably can't weigh in, but I'm curious to know what he does in his office. But with quads, or especially high level quads, yes, there are times when let's say something comes up at work, right, where there like some level of assistance might be needed, right? Like where does that actually fall, or where does that occur? Like I'm just bringing it up because it's just like, I've been fortunate that I've worked in environments where, as a quad, yeah, let's say my urine bag drainer didn't work, right? But like, what does that mean? Is there a designated person like that is my coworker that can be identified? Is that out of the realm of appropriateness for an employer to identify like a coworker buddy? I don't know. Like, I mean, it's just reality. It's real. I don't want to not, I guess, say something about it, knowing that, you know, real stuff can come up. And I'm just curious how we would be able to set anything within government to say how to, I mean, yeah, it's kind of a slippery slope. So I'm just throwing it out there.
No, I appreciate it, Chanda. And I think that slope and how steep it gets is exactly the challenge this group has, is to put forward ideas that are aspirational, is the word I've used previously. Let's say bold here, and helpful and meaningful, while recognizing what is and isn't the role of government policy and requirements versus incentives, and where does best practices and human decency intersect with all of this. I I have yet to find a way in my 20 years of public policy to legislate people not being stupid and people being decent human beings. If anybody can come up with a way on that, you let me know. Councilman Hines, let me get you in, and then Shannon, I'll bring you in.
Chris Hines, Denver City Council. To extend Chanda's question, also as an employer, that we have the same question. So I have people who work for me. My wheelchair cushion slipped out, and I had to get someone to replace my wheelchair cushion back into where it should go. And so all I had were people who worked for me available. And so I was in the very uncomfortable position of asking. I had one male coworker or direct report, and he had just joined a week ago. And do I ask a female coworker to do something that's right near my butt? Or do I ask this new hire male coworker? Do I ask any of my direct reports? Do I just risk your pressure sore? I don't know. So I did ask this gentleman, and I felt very uncomfortable doing so. And I don't know how comfortable or uncomfortable he was in doing it too. So there's the extra burden of, as an employer, as a boss, is that a potential harassment claim? I'm just trying to, make sure that I can be a productive employer and a human being.
Well, yeah, and I think that adding to that, I think that if we can even just set parameters that sets the expectation or boundaries of people with disabilities when we come into work, in a government position, what are available expectations or boundaries that are going to not be able to be crossed or gray or blah, blah, blah. I think it's an appropriate, I don't know. There's got to be some sort of because it's just too real to be going into the workforce with a disability and not be thinking about those, but then also not setting up the conversation ahead of time makes it also feel a little weird. If you don't set up a conversation ahead of time, then it's then you're not setting everybody up for success. I don't know.
Thank you, Shannon. I appreciate everyone's openness on this. Shannon, you're going to get the last word on ideas for our initial brainstorm today, and then I'm going to go to some public comment. Shannon, were you waiting for a sign from Lindsay? Lindsay, are you ready?
Sorry, interpreter could not see. I'm going to pin and go. Okay, sorry. So yes, this is Shannon here. There's really no hard black and white answer that I can offer at this time, but I can imagine just in certain environments where there's a boss and there's an employee, they have to have that understanding, like within the department or the company, when that employee is hired, that they are going to have to include expectations of how to keep that employee working and how to make the company and the department run smoothly. And, if someone is deciding to ignore that conversation, that can really harm that person in the long run. So maybe, more education, socially, things like that on what's needed. And, for example, if there's a deaf person, a lot of people don't know to ask, and, it's okay to ask and get those answers, but a lot of people just don't want to because they think that it might be rude, or they feel they might ask the wrong question or cross boundaries. But really, we welcome those questions because that helps develop a relationship. And that puts us in that place to be able to work like that and make sure people kind of know what to do. So this is a very complex area. It's very fluid as well. So there's no, like I said, hard black and white answer at this time.
Thank you, Shannon. We do have, I think Cheryl, who was with us earlier, had to drop off just now at 11:45. But my colleague Carrie has been chatting with Cheryl quite a bit. Carrie, do you want to share Cheryl's feedback and ideas for the group?
Yeah. Hey, everyone. I'm just going to read off some of the items Cheryl shared in the chat, and I'll make sure to email some of these links around to all of you guys also. She did want to mention that Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act declares medical offices and hospitals as public accommodations that must comply with the ADA regulations. It is important for people with disabilities to receive medical services equal to those services received by a person without a disability. She also mentioned, and this might be something good for us to look into, that the Secretary of State has just hired an accessibility person. Might be interesting for us to hear from them as well. And also that federal law has a non-competitive Schedule A where people provide a notice of disability, their application should be placed on top of the pile. And finally, as Barrick mentioned, she did share with us that Job Action Network. We'll send that link around to all of you guys after the meeting too. So thank you, Cheryl. I appreciate you. I know she had to drop off, but wanted to make sure she was heard here as well.
Councilman Hines, I don't know if you want to respond or if there's just the irony of what's required and what happens.
Yeah, Chris Hines, River City Council. Yeah, I heard the comment about Schedule A. Obviously, I just said 30 minutes ago that I applied Schedule A and got no response. So it's I think that's one of the other things that I mentioned earlier today is that we've got things that look good on paper that aren't in reality. So having an audit process, I think, would make a lot of sense. It's not meant to be overbearing. It's not meant to be painful. It's just meant to make sure that what we say we're doing and what we're doing are the same.
Thanks, Councilman. And unfortunately, much as some states might think otherwise, we're not in a position for our state to take over the federal government and tell them how to run things. I do, however, think that Colorado is well positioned, frankly, with some of our thoughtful leaders on both sides of the aisle to focus on solutions that help us do better and set Colorado as the example, not the federal government. So I will look forward to Councilman Hines, whether it's audits or other means of us showing the folks in Washington what decency, progress, and serving all of our citizens looks like. And I think this group can help us get there. We do have just a couple quick reminders. Our next meeting is coming up pretty quickly because we've had to adjust back over the 4th of July and this month. Our next meeting will be Thursday, August 1st from 3 to 5 p.m. We will bring you back the cleaned up ideas from this. We will move into discussions about participating in public discussions. We'll continue the conversation around accessing government services. I would expect we're going to need 2 more meetings to get all of our ideas together, and then we'll be continuing to intake the responses. As I said at the top of the meeting, you should all have received an email end of the day yesterday with links to the ideas that are up on Engage Dora so far. Those to date are the ideas from this committee on running for and serving in office. And one other committee has put forward some ideas. Outdoor recreation and the COTA rewrite, we'll start rolling theirs out next week. But again, we're meeting Thursday, August 1st from 3 to 5 p.m. I would love if you guys start posting the links to Engage Dora on all your social media, in all your newsletters, sharing those wherever you can. We will bring the ideas and the feedback we get from the public back to all of you. With that, our formal business is concluded. Do any members have anything they'd like to conclude or offer closing remarks? Seeing none, I am happy to give everyone 7 minutes back before I guess some of you are rushing into your next call. I will see you on August 1st on this same call. Reach out if you have more ideas between now and then, or if you have any questions. But thank you as always for the time. I know you've got a lot on your plates already. We really appreciate the time you're giving to this committee's work.